I'm Mike Manier with the Pacific Salmon Foundation. Thank you for joining us for another edition of Salmon Matter, our periodic update and conversations with folks who are active in the salmon conservation and research world. This is a co-production of the Pacific Salmon Foundation and Conversations That Matter, filmed here at Oh Boy Productions in downtown Vancouver. Today we're going to be talking about salmon, but we're also going to be talking about smallmouth bass. We have joining us today Wendy Margetts, who is a biologist studying smallmouth bass as part of her research as a master's student in environmental science through Thompson Rivers University. And recently PSF provided a grant to support Wendy's research, which is focused on the impacts of invasive smallmouth bass in Cultus Lake here in the lower mainland. And so Wendy, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. We're happy to have you to talk about salmon and smallmouth bass.
Yes, I'm happy to be here.
Great. Well, before we jump into your research, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and how you got into this type of work.
Yeah, so I am originally from Ontario, but I went to school in Halifax and then moved to Alberta and finally took a position here in BC. And so far, I've mostly done work in wildlife and wetland research. But when I moved to BC, I really wanted to find out, work on a project that was really at the heart of BC, and salmon and conservation was really what I was drawn to. And so I applied for this position with Dr. Brian Heisey. That's the lab I work in at Thompson Rivers University. And the rest is history. I'm working on this project. I'm on my second year of the second field season now. So I'm about 3/4 of the way through.
Great. Well, what an introduction to British Columbia. And you're certainly working on a species that everyone cares about here in BC, so we're glad to have you doing this. Okay, well, let's get into your research. I'm from the East Coast originally. Of course, smallmouth bass are a fish that anybody on the East Coast is familiar with. Not really a fish, though, native to our waters here in British Columbia, but more and more people are finding these fish, and it's becoming actually a fairly active recreational fishing opportunity for some in British Columbia. So why don't you begin by telling us about smallmouth bass? What kind of fish are they? What are the attributes that we should be familiar with? And what about how they're adapting here in British Columbia, and how do they adapt?
Yeah, absolutely. So to give you some background information, they were first introduced to BC in the early 1900s, and this was through legal introductions. So the government decided to boost sport fishing in our lakes in BC, that bass were a warm-watered fish and that they would do well here. So they brought the bass over to a few lakes. Later on, as science improved, they realized probably not a good idea to be spreading species, and so they stopped doing those legal introductions. But since then, they have been spread illegally to quite a few areas in British Columbia. And this is just due to people loving to fish for them. They put up a good fight, and I'm not an angler myself, but I've been told many times that people love to fish for them. Some people eat them, but it's really more about the fishing experience. And so they have been spread illegally throughout the province. In Cultus Lake specifically, they were introduced, we think, between 2016 and 2017, based on aging their otoliths or their ear bones. That's the age range that we think they introduced them, and we think someone did a good job at it. They didn't just toss one bass in there. They put a few in, they knew what they were doing. And the reason they do so well here is that they are highly adaptable. So the only constricting measure that they need is they need the water to be at least 12 degrees to spawn. But apart from that, they can live they live in northern Ontario, cold lakes, up to thermal effluent canals, 35 degrees. So they have a huge range. They spawn in rocky areas, and so not areas without a ton of vegetation, but they love areas that have been developed. So, beachfronts and that sort of thing where there's not as much natural area. So a lot of that around here as well. And they're a generalist feeder. So they will eat anything from invertebrates and fish, crayfish. They've even been known to eat amphibians and some small mammals. So there's lots of reports of crazy things, but they really do eat everything. And then they outcompete native species for those invertebrates and that sort of thing, and also for habitat. So really, they have a huge range of characteristics that make them ideal for these lakes and ideal to really take over. As well as they have that spiny dorsal fin. And so that's a protective spine, and there aren't a ton of natural predators for this fish. So all in all, not great for us because they really, once they have a hold on the lake, they take over. But yeah, they are thriving.
And obviously, when you say not good for us, we are the Pacific Salmon Foundation. They're not really good for salmon. So tell us, how that works in the context for salmon. At what point in the life cycle of a Pacific salmon are smallmouth bass problematic? Is it at the beginning or all throughout? And obviously, Cultus Lake there's salmon spawning habitat there, sockeye salmon. It's well marked and lots of great signage. So we know there are salmon in Cultus Lake, and there's a great effort for conservation. So tell us more about what are the impacts that these fish. Tell us about your research and whether you think they are impacting salmon in Cultus Lake.
Yeah, so we know they are. We have evidence from that now. And so that was one of the main goals coming into this project, was looking at their impacts on the Cultus Lake specific population of sockeye and also on the endangered pygmy sculpin. They're the really cute little pygmies that live at the bottom of Cultus Lake. So we wanted to see what their impacts were on these two species at risk. We did diet analysis this winter from bass that we caught throughout the spring and summer last year, and we found that they are in fact feeding on the sockeye that come into Cultus. So we found that 25% of our 95 samples had some sort of sockeye in their stomachs. That's a pretty high percentage, considering that small outmigration is just really in the spring. So that we know that they are eating those smolts as they're as they're growing and as they're outmigrating. So if you're familiar with Cultus, the main water connector is Swelter Creek that connects to the Vedder and then the Fraser. And so these bass, their main habitat in Cultus is actually right at the mouth of that Swelter Creek, and that's also the main pathway for these salmon. And so we're finding that those two habitats are overlapping, and they are eating the salmon right there. And in other news, we have had reports that the bass are getting into the Vedder. So we've had people catch them in the Vedder River as well. They survive in rivers and lakes. So yeah, we know that they're spreading, and we know that they can have, this project is becoming more that they're having a greater impact than we could have imagined. We thought it was just the Cultus Lake sockeye that they could be impacting, but they could be impacting a lot more once they get into those river systems.
It's fascinating. Yeah, and we are lucky we get to go to Cultus Lake once or twice every summer with my family, and it's such a narrow little area there, that little creek that connects into the lake, and the beautiful signage there and the habitat for sockeye. It is distressing to think that all the work that goes into conserving sockeye there could be undermined by this particular species. So you are in I think you've done 2 years of your research, and how many years long will this study need to be for you to feel like you have good defensible findings that you can write up and share with the province and DFO?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I definitely want to graduate at some point. We keep making the project bigger because there's just so much to know.
Yeah.
And I've been really lucky with this project, and we've been in collaboration with the provincial fisheries management and DFO and you at PSF. And so we have lots of connections here and lots of people interested in the project. And so, for example, one thing we're doing is we are destroying nests to try and suppress the population. And so that's something that I'm doing for DFO for their data and their information. So this is technically my last field season this summer. But my professor is already dreaming up having another student continue this project after me, because it's such a interesting ecosystem and dynamic that's going on there between, the 19 species of fish that live in Cultus Lake. So yeah, I could definitely see the project being extended past myself if we get the funding and that sort of thing.
Well, and back to the fishing experience with smallmouth bass, I've fished for them, and it is a great experience. You're right. So naturally we have a situation here where people love Pacific salmon. We know that sockeye salmon in particular all throughout the Fraser, including Cultus Lake, are in very serious conservation decline. And we've got to try to do everything we can all along their life cycle, freshwater, estuary, out to the ocean, to try to fix that. But you probably have people that love to fish smallmouth bass who also probably love to fish salmon, and also are committed to conservation in that context. So what do you say to people who, maybe they don't know that this is a problem, and then what about if you have someone who says, no, smallmouth bass is not a problem, let's keep them there in Cultus Lake. You seem like a very good communicator, Wendy. How do you sort of convince people of what you're learning through your research?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because coming into this project, one of the things that drew me into it was the engagement aspect. And I couldn't have even imagined how much controversy there would be over this. But, I have found in general, I try to, anyone that I see fishing on the lake when I'm there, or I have people come up and talk to me all the time on the beach. And, in general, especially the people that live around Cultus, as soon as they like to know the exact why they're bad. Some people say, okay, there's bass, but so what? There's just another species. Once I list out for them why they're bad, they outcompete for food, they eat our native species, they're highly invasive and adaptable, so they spread, then most people I find will say, okay, how can I help? And so that's really nice to hear. There are definitely a few groups that do not feel that way, and they have been very outspoken about this project even, and trying to not let it go forward because they want the bass here, and I think for those people, you can try and educate as much as possible, but we just need more enforcement, and that's, I don't know how to convince them.
Well, and I think when you look in the totality at invasive species, in other words, species that are not from British Columbia, shouldn't be here in our waters, and the very clear aggressive impacts they have on habitat and directly on salmon, it's a pretty convincing argument when people understand that. Green crab's another one that we're seeing more and more of in estuaries, and they destroy the vegetation, the nearshore vegetation that, again, the young salmon need. And this it seems to be these invasive species just grow and grow and grow exponentially, and it's hard to get a handle on. So, okay, well, let's ask you now about, you mentioned that you're going to be phasing out. You want to graduate at some point, and I hope you will call me when you graduate. We always could use smart people working at PSF. But, what are I always like to ask scientists, what are the gaps that you see in your research? In other words, the things that need to be done to sort of provide a fuller picture, a fuller understanding. What's your recommendation, I guess, to put it differently, to your advisor for how to, carry this forward in a meaningful way, this type of research on smallmouth bass?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I haven't totally thought about that, but when you bring that up, the first thing that comes to my mind is, so much as I go forth in my career, I'm learning that I can't just look at the animals and look at the plants all the time. It's a holistic picture that includes community. And so I think that if we're going to have any real impact on helping these native species, then really it starts with education and prevention. And so, doing maybe a study that includes more interviews and that sort of thing, looking at people's perceptions and how we can change those perceptions, especially at a lake like Cultus, when it's one of the most popular lakes in BC. So there's so many different stakeholders and groups coming to the lake and with different interests. And so honestly, I think that looking at more of those interactions and how those interactions impact our lake, I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah, good. Yeah, and as you say, the communication is piece, is essential part of this. You have so many people visiting that lake on the beaches and the boats. I mean, in the summer months, spring months, it's a great opportunity to get out and person to person sort of have those conversations, social distanced, of course. So you mentioned the engagement earlier, Wendy, that was one of the things that really appealed to you about this. So what are there opportunities for people to assist as citizen scientists, to just come out and volunteer or get involved in some way, and tell us what those are and how do people follow up on that?
Yes, we do. I would love if people came to the lake and actually fished for us. So we are trying to run
I'm
a
there.
marker
I'm ready.
come on out. It's one of the easiest volunteer programs that I've ever tried to run.
Yeah, I bet.
But yeah, so one of the parts of this is we're trying to get a scope on how many fish are in the lake. And so to do that, we're running a mark recapture program. So we're tagging probably about 100 bass with green spaghetti tags that go right below their dorsal fins, and their external tags. And so we're hoping that when people fish for bass, they can send me some information. So they can send me the date they were fishing, the number of hours they spent fishing, the length of the approximate length of the fish, and the tag number if they caught a tagged bass. So all of this information we have actually on the Fraser Valley Invasives website that I'm hoping maybe we can put a link to that in somewhere on this post. And yeah, so all that is listed there. So you don't have to remember exactly what I'm saying. But yes, so there's kind of two types of fish we have in the lake right now. We have pink tagged bass, that if you catch a pink tagged bass, please release it immediately. These ones have our acoustic tags, which we're tracking them throughout the lake to find out their habitat. But if you catch a non-tagged or a green tagged bass, then we ask everyone to report that information to myself at my email, which is wmargetts@tru.ca, which will also be linked here. And you can either kill or release those fish. We just following provincial regulation, which is I think it's 20 bass per day you're allowed to catch. So yeah, so come fish for us.
That sounds great. So when we talk about tagging, these green tags that you're putting on, they're actually just a tag that's on the exterior of the fish. It has a small number that can be read. Explain to people watching, I have a little rule that if you use a 10-cent word, you have to boil it down to a nickel word. So an acoustic tag, well, how does an acoustic tag work if you're not a fisheries expert?
Yeah, so this was all new to me as well at the beginning of this project, but it's been really interesting. It's a method that's used a lot with our sturgeon here in BC.
Yes.
But basically, we are implanting these tags. They're about this, they look like a little bullet almost. They're about this big into the fish. So we surgically implant those. And then we release the fish. And we also have these receivers that look and are about the size of my water bottle here. And they're these receivers that we put down in the bottom of the lake. And the fish with the acoustic tag sends out a ping, and the receiver listens for that ping, and then I download that data, and I'm able to see which receivers have picked up which fish. So I'm able to see where the fish are going, if they're having daily migrations, seasonal migrations. And these tags also have temperature loggers on them. So it's really cool because we're actually able to get a 3-dimensional picture of where they are in the water column as well when we match that to our water column temperatures. So our hopes with this is, one, we're finding out exactly where they're spawning, and also seeing where if their habitat is overlapping with those species at risk, so if they're hanging out right at Sweltzer Creek, and also if they're hanging out in the same areas that our endangered pygmy sculpin are in. So that's kind of the main objectives of this data, but there's so much more you can do with it. It's really interesting.
That is fascinating. And these acoustic tags, we're using them quite a bit at the Salmon Foundation with our research, to do just what you're describing. Not only tracking, but being able to get that fuller picture of the life cycle of salmon, where they're going, where we're losing them. It's remarkable technology, and we need to be doing more of it. We need more funding for this tagging type of research. So cool that you are using it there. And I've been out on the Sturgeon Society boats many times, and they have the little wand, and they wand the fish, and records and logs are kept. And this is all very responsible conservation, citizen science work that people can get involved with. And so I really hope that this video, when we put it out on social media and YouTube, will encourage people. And I would say even to people who want to be able to fish for smallmouth bass in British Columbia, come out and help with the science. No better way to learn about this than be out on the water and talk to the researchers and the scientists themselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have a few minutes here left in time, Wendy, to talk about this. You kind of stimulated a thought for me. Are there ways, physical structures, netting or whatnot? I know, when we visited Australia, they have shark nets that keep sharks off of the coastline where people are swimming. Have these been used elsewhere? I know Atlantic Salmon Federation, our sister organization on the east coast of Canada and the U.S., they're very concerned about this. They have a whole research program in the Miramichi in New Brunswick, and they've already moved forward to really trying to eradicate these because of the concerns with their native Atlantic salmon. But are there non-lethal ways to sort of deal with this, keep them out of the spawning habitat, or is that just pie in the sky thinking? It's okay, you can tell me if it is.
I like to always have some hope, but managing invasive fish is a very difficult issue, as you know. And so especially when there are migratory fish in those places that you would potentially set nets or something like that. And so there have been quite a few projects. The Miramichi, like you mentioned, the Beaver Lake system in BC, they had a brig eradication project. And from what I've read in other papers, it's about the amount of effort you put in and also targeting the right age groups. So they're finding that's why we're doing nest destruction, to see if that helps at all with suppression of the species. We're not going to get rid of them, unfortunately, but suppression, because if you kill the young of the year or the eggs, then there's a greater chance that the population will be decreased the next year, as well as if you only fish out the big fish. So if you're only gill netting, if you're only angling, then they actually, the bigger fish sometimes eat the smaller fish, so they're cannibalistic. And so you have this overcompensation effect that happens if you really just target those big fish. So you need to be targeting different age classes with different strategies. And so, those two projects that we mentioned, those have, they've put millions of dollars into those and a lot of effort. So it's possible that we could definitely put some more effort into the Cultus Lake issue. There is the fish fence up that's at the DFO station, so that's actually kind of nice. So we collaborate a lot with them, and so whenever the bass gets stopped there, so that's kind of nice, at least for the months that the fish gate is in, and that's to count the salmon smolts going out. So there is that in place right now. But yeah, my biggest thing is just prevention. I mean, obviously we'd like to fix these issues that are ongoing, but I think the more money we can put into prevention and education, I think we'll have a greater impact on the future of our lakes.
Yeah, and so I hear you saying it's pretty much about population control, trying to manage this down to a more smaller number of smallmouth bass.
Yeah.
What I forgot to ask you at the outset, a couple basic questions. One, what's the life cycle in terms of number of years for a smallmouth bass, and then how widely distributed in BC? Do we know, how many lakes systems have the species?
So, in terms of the life cycle, so they usually become mature and they can start laying eggs 3 to 4 years old. And then how long they live, I mean, the oldest bass that we've caught in Cultus are only 4 years old, but that's obviously because they were put there recently. But in other areas they can live a lot longer, 7, 8 years, and they get quite big. So I think the
Yeah.
biggest bass we've caught in Cultus is about 3 pounds, but we expect as the years go on, they will get bigger. And in terms of their distribution in BC, so the last published, I believe the last published document from the government was in 2010 on their distribution. And I think there's around 5 major areas that they're in, Penticton, the Beaver Lakes, Vancouver Island, that sort of thing. Cultus Lake was the first known lower mainland. So that's kind of why it was a big deal for us.
Yeah, and I've even read somewhere Salt Spring Island. Is that right? Did I see that correctly?
I believe they are. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's in southern Vancouver Island and in some of those smaller
Yeah.
islands around there. Yeah.
Wow,
They really.
remarkable.
Yeah.
Wendy, this is really fascinating. So happy that you were able to come on, and so happy that you're doing this research. I think it's probably important just to give you at the end here an opportunity to sort of make your elevator pitch, if it will, or your sales pitch. You hit it on the head. A lot of issues related to the environment, related to fisheries, certainly related to salmon are contentious. But I do find that we are, particularly with the state of many of our stocks right now being in a bit of a dire state, obviously, particularly our Fraser stocks, people are really coming together and just wanting to find common ground and do everything they can for the salmon. So in closing, just leave it to you. Let you have the last word. What's your message to people for why we have to get this under control, the smallmouth bass issue?
Yeah. So I think for me, especially just spending so much time there and being with that community, there are so many passionate people around Cultus Lake that really want to see this project thrive. And even though we have had, people trying to cut the pink tags off our bass to destroy the project and some online trolling going on about getting rid of it, I think in general, everybody wants to help and do their best. And so even with our project data, for example, the sockeye are currently under review for SARA listing. And so hopefully our data will be able to improve their status and help with that new report. But I definitely go back and forth whether between this is an impossible problem, but I think more than anything, it kind of like joins the community. And because it joins people, it joins the anglers with the local community at Cultus Lake, with the park board, and everybody has kind of rallied together and been like, okay, this is a worthy cause. We need to help with this so that we can save our amazing lake that has huge diversity, with lots of sport fish and other endangered species. So I think that that's kind of the main takeaway from this, is the positivity from the community, and that there is kind of a bright light coming from this in terms of getting people together and helping with salmon conservation.
Wendy, thank you so much. Keep us posted on your research. When will you be writing this up? When can we expect to see a report?
Hopefully later this summer.
Okay,
I'll
good.
have my first paper ready later in this fall, and then I think I'm hoping to defend this winter. So
good stuff. Well, we're evidence-driven, science-driven at the Pacific Salmon Foundation. You're doing some great new research. Wendy Margetts, thank you so much for joining us from Thompson Rivers University. You keep well, and we'll look forward to hearing more from your results when they're all done. So that'll wrap it up for this episode of Salmon Matter on smallmouth bass, an invasive species which are affecting our Pacific salmon here in BC. This is a co-production of the Pacific Salmon Foundation and Conversations That Matters, and it's filmed here at Oh Boy Studios in Vancouver. Thanks for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you again very soon. Keep well.